Get started. So, welcome to Trauma-Informed Engagement. We are so glad that you're here, and thank you for taking this journey with us today. Engagement is vital to strong communities, and adopting a trauma-informed approach is vital to the success of our families and our communities everywhere. Today, we're going to work together to identify best practices in trauma-informed strategies to develop a strong and effective engagement plan. I'd like to introduce my co-trainers, our co-presenters. Dr. Kynetta McFarlane is a clinical psychologist with expertise in trauma and diversity issues. Kynetta, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. Y'all can all call me Sugar, though.
All right, Sugar, we'll be that from now on. And Dani Beale, whom you may notice has the same last name as me, and that's because she is my wife. But for today, we'll focus on the fact that she has a degree in diversity studies and serves as a diversity consultant for our small business called Life Adventures for All. So welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, hi, Dani. Did you say hi? I wasn't sure you were back yet.
I said hi anyway.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Here we go. And I want to remind people, just in case there was any confusion, this is part one. It is really a two-part training. It's meant to be a full day, but we thought it'd be more palatable for people to be able to do 2 afternoons instead of a full day. And so next week, same time, same login, we'll do part 2. Both parts have lots of interesting activities and discussions, and I hope you settle in for a good afternoon of learning with us. Before I get very far, though, I need to say thank you to our partners for this training, as well as the developers of the content and the presentation. I've done a lot of work with this training and have adjusted it for whatever population that we're speaking with, but the original base training came out of an effort in our Ohio's Early Childhood Mental Health Initiative, led by Dr. Valerie Alloy. And the developers were some colleagues of mine down at Hopewell Health Centers in Ohio, Aaron Lucas and Misty Cole. So thanks to the state of Ohio for allowing us to have access to this kind of training and to share it with others. All righty. First of all, a little housekeeping. Number 1, take care of yourselves. We're the trainers, and we're going to do the best we can to make sure that everybody stays safe and comfortable in the space of this training, but it's up to you to take care of yourself. It can be exhausting to be on virtual platforms all day, and so we're going to try to break it up with activities and discussions, but it's up to you to take care of yourself. So first of all, a little content warning. We're going to talk about heavy topics. We're going to talk about oppression. We're going to talk about trauma, and that takes its own toll. We're not going to traumatize or oppress you on purpose. However, discussing those sorts of issues can be stressful, and in truth is known as secondary traumatic stress. And so be aware. This isn't light and fluffy. Another thing I'd like to say is you should take deep breaths. It turns out recent research indicates that we tend to breathe less and take shallow breaths when we're online, something called Zoom apnea now. So by the end of the day or by the end of a big online session like this, we're uptight and worn out, even though it seems like we're sitting around doing almost nothing. So we have 2 suggestions to make today easier on your nervous system. First, the solution to Zoom apnea, simply take a deep breath in and a long exhale out. The long exhale triggers your parasympathetic nervous system to relax. We're going to try to prompt you to do these deep breaths at least once an hour, but whenever you feel yourself leaning in and tightening up your shoulders, put them down and take a nice deep breath with a long out breath. Secondly, part of our stress online comes from seeing ourselves. Seriously, it's like we're trying to work or pay attention to others while watching ourselves in a little mirror. The solution is for you to turn off your self view. So let me help you with that. Go to your own little Hollywood square thing and go to the top corner of it and click on those 3 dots and slide down to the bottom of that menu and say, turn off self view. Okay. So now that I've said that, though, we're going to want you to turn your view. We want you to turn your cameras on when you go. Catherine West, stop messing around with my annotation there. Let me.
Sorry, I didn't. I'm on my phone. I never have done a Zoom call on my phone before. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I see you drawing on the board. We'll do that later. So turn those self views off, but be ready to turn your cameras on when you go to breakout rooms so you can have eye-to-eye contact with the people that you're with. Let's see, what else do we have here? How about passive participation? So we now have 130 people online with us, and that can be daunting for some of us. We're going to put you into small groups, pretty small, as a matter of fact, 3 to 4 people. So you won't be talking in front of hundreds. However, some people are still intimidated by that. And I just want to give you permission to pass, permission to be passive, permission to not speak up in the breakout rooms or in the rest of the training. On the other hand, I would like to say there are a lot of participation opportunities here. You can use the chat and we'll instruct you periodically to throw something in the chat for all of us to see. We will have some polls coming up here. Will be your first poll in just a minute. And we will use those breakout rooms so that you can have discussions about some of the things that we go over. And finally, Catherine West was showing you that you have the ability to annotate, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't annotate until you're asked to. Otherwise, I have to spend my time going around erasing things. So I think that's it. Participate to the best of your abilities, folks. You'll get more out of it, but if you need to pass on something, by all means, feel free to do so. So right now, we're going to start the poll. And the first thing we want to find out is, who's here? Who are we? And so, where's my poll? There it is. Launching poll number 1. So, you should have a screen up now. And you should have a variety of questions. Start answering them about your race, your age, your religion, your sexuality, your income, your profession. Okay? And let us, we're going to give everybody 2 minutes to sort of skip through this and give us your responses. There we go. Meanwhile, one of the things I didn't ask on the poll, although more than 80 of you have already voted, is where you're from. And I would love to hear either what state you're from in the United States, or what province in Canada, or what country if you're from outside of the US or Canada. And
oh, we got Vancouver, we got Michigan, New York, Alberta, Ohio, Calgary, Cleveland, Boulder, Tacoma, West Virginia, Kentucky, Euclid, Berkeley, B. Moore, I'm from DC, Anchorage, Portland, Oregon, Evanston, Illinois. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing some people's places. Treaty 1 Territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Philly. Jenkinstown, PA.
All right, well, we've reached 2 minutes and I have 121 out of 128 people, or 94% have voted. So I'm going to call it right now, and I'm going to share the results so that we can look at them together. So we are predominantly a white group. 102 of us are white, and then a smattering of everything else, which is good. Honestly, I welcome everybody here, but I think of all the people out there right now, it's us white people who need to learn more about these issues. Age-wise, 37% of us are 39% of us are under 30. 34% of us are between 30 and 40. And then a few less than that in the other categories. Religious affiliation is 40% Christian, 24% atheist. Oops, wait, the second category is 27% other. And if you, what is an other? What religious affiliation did we not include there for you? You could add that into the chat. Kynetta will tell us what's happening over there. Sexuality, 80% of us are heterosexual. And then 10% of us are lesbian, gay, or bisexual. 2% asexual, and 6% identify as queer. 1% questioning or other. Gender, we are mostly female, folks. 70% female, 28% male. 1 non-binary and 1 trans male. Welcome. And income-wise, the majority of us, 29% are between 40 and 60,000, and 26% is 20 to 40,000. So there we have 40, 50, 55% of us are between 20 and 60,000. And then we have 18%, 60 to 80, and less than 10% in the higher categories. And then finally, where do you come from? How do you engage with your people? Education is 26%. Outdoor camp and rec people, 36%. Team builders, 13%. And behavioral health or therapy, 17%. All right, let's pull that down.
In terms of our religions, we got lots of UUs, agnostics, Sufi, technically a branch of Islam, agnostics. In terms of one of the other race and ethnicity groups, we have Arab American, and some people say no religion.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for your participation. It does give us a little bit of an idea of who we are. But now, let's do some more personal introductions. What's in a name? I would like you to, I'm guessing that most of you are in a position where you can find a scrap of paper and something to write with. And I'd like you to write your entire name on a piece of paper. And then, in just 1 or 2 sentences, write the story of your name below it. Any story that could go along with your name, including any history or meaning associated with your name, who you might have been named after, if you've ever been embarrassed by your name, if you've made any changes to your name over time, what are your nicknames, etc. Try to capture the story of your name, and I'm going to give you 1 minute to write those sentences down. All right, this is going to take us into breakout room number 1. And you're going to take turns introducing yourself and sharing your story about your name in an uninterrupted way. So take turns and everybody gets 1 minute to talk about how they came to be the name that they are, and listen to the other people in your room, and we'll give you just this less than 5 minutes to sort of say hi and introduce yourselves. Here we go. Hey there.
Hi.
Hey.
We have a handful of people who are not in a room.
Yes. Were they not assigned, or
No,
did
they're
they
assigned, so they're just not tuning
just
in.
didn't want to jump in? That's cool.
Yeah.
It looks so good, Bob.
Yeah, it does. It
I'm
really
loving it.
does.
Every slide, I'm like, oh, it's so cute.
Yeah, it looks so much nicer.
I
Yeah.
took a
And so much
class on
cleaner.
PowerPoint building, Kynetta,
Oh, okay.
and they had a lot of tricks.
Okay.
I'm only using half of what they taught me.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so you guys should be aware. Somebody watch the chat. I think they're talking. No, I guess not. No religion.
Yeah.
Did you see how many you used?
Yeah, lots of you used.
That's hysterical. Oh, well, you know, I invited them.
I advertised out in like a couple different places for ministers. So,
No Melissa, though.
I didn't see her. I didn't remind her either, though.
Me neither. So what I want you to be aware of as we move, oops, I'm messing with my roller. As we move forward, what I want you to be aware of is that you have to click through things now.
Right.
Do you see what I mean? Like I have to click, there's day one, here's our objectives, here's day two, here's that. And so as you move through things,
Mm-hmm.
you have to click through it.
Right.
So
Now,
ideally you should have the presenter screen when it's your turn, you hit present. If you have it set, you're looking at a presenter screen. So I always in the top right corner see what the next click will bring me.
right. I want to see the presenter screen. It's under slideshow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hold it. Where is the view presenter screen?
Right, that's what I'm looking for too.
No problem, Jack. I don't see that.
Yeah, now that I'm in it, I can't help you. Usually when you hit on the PowerPoint, if you hit slideshow, it brings up those options. Yeah, if you hit slideshow, the menu to the right says use presenter view. and you can click yes.
When you hit.
All right, I'm bringing them back though.
Okay.
So we have 60 seconds. And listen, I'm happy to click through.
Yeah, you may. Yeah, you may have to click through for mine because I can't figure it out.
All right, we'll practice for next week.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to practice for next week too. I'm having.
Then I just do the clicking. It's all good.
Okay. Just
Because yeah, when I went through it, I could see where you had put in the directions that like click, like you know what I mean. You had put it in the directions. So
Right, and on my view, that it has the script and the clicks. All right, here they come. 65.
Yeah, I just see your screen that you're showing everybody.
The Chill Foundation.
I don't know.
Maybe I have to have control, Bobby, like that. Like
Yeah.
what I just did.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's part of why I can't see it, because you still have.
Right, I would stop sharing and then you can click it. If
Yeah.
you have trouble, then I could immediately start again. But here we go. We're back up to 125 something.
Okay.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a moment to introduce yourself to the group. I know it was a little fast, but we want to move on with the content. So here's what we hope to accomplish, and here's our agenda. Today's day one, and we're going to go over trauma-informed engagement and association and perception. That's our own association and perception of things. And systemic racism. Next week, on day two, we're going to look at the structural inequalities and the racial inequities that exist, at least in the United States. And while we're doing particularly poorly in terms of those issues here in the United States right now, these are issues that are impacting most places around the globe. We also are going to check out implicit bias and talk about some personal and program strategies to address some of these issues. So here we go. Based on national statistics, we know that between 55 and 90% of us either know someone who's been impacted by trauma or have been impacted ourselves by trauma. And by the way, folks, when I say trauma, I'm talking about childhood trauma. Lots of us are experiencing different traumas throughout our adult life, but the difference is that we have a fully developed brain. For better or worse, we have a fully developed brain as adults. And so a lot of the focus is on childhood adverse experiences or trauma because it literally rewires how your brain works. So this first slide is just to show you the national prevalence in the United States of people who have experienced childhood traumas. And the truth is, it's pretty high. And off to the far right over here, you can see that there are state ranges, whoever is the lowest. So for instance, how about living with someone who is mentally ill or suicidal? California is the lowest with 5.4% of the people endorsing that one. And Montana is the highest with 14% endorsing that one. So this is how you read this chart. But basically what we want to say is there's a lot of trauma out there. Okay. So we're going to be discussing things that might be triggering in terms of all these trauma. And if you need to take a breath or take a walk or in any other way take care of your own needs, you are absolutely encouraged to do so. So we're going to look at it through a frame of trauma-informed engagement. So there's trauma everywhere, and we need to be careful. And one of the things that I want to say, and we may come across it again in the slideshow, is that there's even higher rates of trauma in the helping professions because we tend to come back into these professions so that we can help others. And so the same things won't happen to them that may have happened to us, that sort of thinking or rationale behind it. And so teachers and therapists and social workers, we tend to have higher rates than those rates that I just showed you. Kynetta,
All right.
pass
So,
it on to you. Do you want me to
yeah.
click?
Yes, please. So right now we're going to be talking about family engagement, and most of us that are here work with children, youth, and their families. And so it's very important for us in terms of engaging with families because that is one of the biggest keys to our success. So let's go through and let's just start defining like what family engagement is. So this first slide shows us that family engagement is really about the systemic inclusion of families in our activities and our programs, and these things that promote a child's development, their learning, their wellness. And all this includes the planning, development, and an evaluation in an organization. And so one of the big key pieces about family engagement is that we are engaging family as partners. And so that while we are providing services, we are encouraging the entire family's growth and development. And then the last area that we're looking at is really recognizing that that engagement is the foundation for our success across many different areas in terms of all of those different areas that we come from. Having an engaged family, we see, is that foundation for us to have some successful work and communication. And so this next slide really goes through and looks at the different ways and the different benefits that we get from family engagement. So that first step looks at how when we have engaged families, we're more likely to have positive outcomes in the family. That next step looks at how when we have that good engagement, it improves the family's ability to cope with their own issues outside of our intervention. That next step looks at how when we build and improve that engagement, we increase a family's decision-making skills. Next thing we're looking at is we empower families to make better and more informed decisions about the services that they're participating in. And finally, we're increasing a family's personal sense of power and their self-efficacy. So when we have that engagement, our families feel more powerful and feel like they can do the things that they want to do. So when we involve our families in system level decision making, we get better dialogues with our families. We get much more buy-in because they actually feel like they have a stake and a voice in what we're talking about. So all that leads to more engagement. And because we're making them a part of the decision making, we get better decisions. And that leads to us holding our agencies that we're all accountable to, making them better in terms of really looking at making sure that they're actually fitting the needs of the people that they're serving. So now we're going to talk about, like, we have all these good benefits, right? But we also do have things that get in the way of our engagement. So what we're going to do now is send you off to a chat. And so, oh, we're not?
We're going to brainstorm for a minute and add your ideas into the chat and out loud because I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Okay. What gets in the way of your engagement with whoever it is you're working with? You can add it to the chat or you can talk out loud to us and Kynetta. Or Sugar. What gets in the way?
What do you think makes it hard for you to engage with families or for families to engage with you?
This is Roberto on the phone. I think we do, meaning the adults,
and
the staff, the parents. Our own issues, whether there are biases, our preconceptions, all of those things that we know we shouldn't allow to impact us, but do.
Thank you.
Yeah, hey, this is Bernie Roop. For us, I think there's a lot of, I'll call it chaos in the lives of our kids. And so sometimes there's a crisis or something happens and all of a sudden they're not there. They're off dealing with whatever's going on.
We got inside of the chat, we got stigmas on getting help, language, resource and the ability to access them, COVID-19 guidelines, burnout and compassion fatigue, transportation, geography and technology gaps, childcare issues. It's not something that's actually a part of our program officially. Access to phones, ignorance, in the field in terms of in the wilderness with clients versus family and their location at home, scheduling, distrust of systems, different goals, parents being busy with work responsibilities, money, program expectations. So we got lots of different areas.
Excellent. Thanks everybody for your participation. And I'm going to jump in here for a minute because we got this current event going on. COVID-19. So on top of all the other issues related to this topic, we are all impacted by COVID-19. So what happens is COVID-19 is a chronic stressor right now. As you should know this, we've been involved with it for 7 months now. And so it is a trauma, but it's labeled a chronic stressor because it's so unrelenting. It's not a trauma event that you have and then you're over it or past it. So it falls in this chronic stress category. When you have a lot of trauma and chronic stress, it activates your stress response system. When your stress response system is activated, you tend to use your survival skills. You probably all know about these survival skills: fight, flight, and freeze. These are very common reactions to help you survive or to, evade the saber-toothed tiger or just take care of yourself when it feels like nobody else is. So if our survival skills are activated and they're supposed to save us, what's wrong with that? That should be okay, right? Well, let's dig deep into those survival skills for just a minute here. Survival skills are actually intended to help us escape or get away from those perceived threats, okay? They also help us alleviate pain or distress that's caused by perceived or inescapable threat. And I'd really like to draw your attention to perceived. It doesn't have to be the same for everybody. If you perceive something as horribly frightening and threatening, then that's what it is for you. And children may perceive things differently than adults. So just remember, what is perceived as an inescapable threat is what's going to trigger these survival skills. And then what do survival skills look like? Well, they look like aggression, impulsivity, and self-centeredness. And you might say, wait, Bobbi, you just said fight, flight, or freeze, except aggression is fight, impulsivity is flight, and self-centeredness is freeze. And so that it's one thing to label something fight, flight, and freeze and be like, oh, that's survival skills. We'll just be careful around that. But the truth is, we see these symptoms, we see these behaviors all the time. And we don't like it very much when people act aggressively, impulsively, or very self-centered. And a lot of times, particularly if they're children exhibiting these behaviors, we punish them. And we try to get them to stop doing their survival skills, which is really difficult to stop your brain from trying to make you survive. So you want to think of survival skills as ways that any reasonable person would act in order to escape a threat or alleviate some pain. And then the bottom line of this slide is my personal soapbox for a decade now. We must stop punishing trauma responses and survival skills. It's not helpful. It doesn't do what you want it to do. It doesn't just stop those behaviors. It actually exacerbates the trauma response, and it's very difficult, makes it even more difficult to work with that person. So Essentially, the problem is that strong negative emotions trigger our survival mode in the limbic system and the amygdala. That's great for outrunning that saber-toothed tiger, but it prevents your prefrontal cortex from functioning. It prevents reflection. It prevents broader perspectives. It prevents considering others. Unfortunately for all of us, it's an either-or situation. Either you're in your limbic system or you're in your thinking and learning brain. We can't really use both parts of our brain at the same time. And this presents from very specific issues for anyone in the helping professions or the teaching professions. We definitely need our clients and students and families to be in touch with their prefrontal cortex, or they can't actually learn. They're trapped in a reaction mode. So now, more than ever, we have to be trauma informed. So I'm going to toss it back to Kynetta to talk about a trauma-informed approach.
And so all the things that Bobbi was just talking about are all the things that we need to take into consideration where we're starting to change our culture in terms of changing our culture and really looking at things in a trauma-informed way. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we're talking about what are the principles and practices that change and promote that culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. And this is based on all that information that we know about trauma, how often it affects people, how it impacts people. And so based on all this information, we need to really adopt this trauma-informed care and viewpoint when dealing with others. And so this viewpoint, this culture change is not just one specific technique or checklist. It's about constantly looking at, being aware of, being sensitive of all of those changes that we need to take. So when we think about like all of us as being parts of organizations, what are some of the barriers that you feel like exist inside of organizations that make it difficult for us to take a trauma-informed approach? And so you can put it in the chat or you can speak out loud.
While you're thinking about those barriers again, and the reason we're focusing on the barriers is because that's what we've all got to overcome to become trauma-informed and to do some of this work. I also wanted to say, because I failed to at the beginning, you will get a PDF of this PowerPoint. So you do not have to sit there and try to capture what you're seeing on the screen. You'll get a PDF of 2 slides per page, nice and big so you can read everything. So I just wanted to get back in there and say that before we get too far in. Thanks, Kynetta.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the barriers that you all feel like in your organizations that make it hard for you to have that trauma-informed approach? Feeling like there's not enough time to like do things in a different way. Some of the culture that exists, not understanding like what a family needs and like what a family's priorities are, lack of education, lack of feeling like you have enough time to educate yourself, having enough staff, having compassion fatigue, differences between like ideal timelines versus like realistic changes, stress over service providers. And then also how like seriously people like have to take like some of the COVID precautions in terms of RIPS, in terms of what a job says is about COVID precautions versus like internal, what do you feel are COVID precautions you should be taking? All right.
All right, thank you
so much.
And if you're not adding stuff into the chat, you might want to look at it. There's a lot of good stuff flowing through that chat. But let's move ahead to the 4 R's of trauma-informed care.
So the 4 R's of trauma-informed care are realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. And these are all important pieces of trauma-informed engagement. And these are the pieces that are at the foundation. So let's look at these first 4 strategies. So the first one, realizing the widespread impact of trauma, and understanding how like it affects people's like different paths that they end up on, and also realizing how it affects like what recovery looks like to other people. So in terms of for myself, when I'm thinking about like the families that I'm working with, why is it important for me to realize that trauma is both impacting them, it is probably impacting me, and it is also impacting what looks like success for this family. In terms of recognizing, that's where we're recognizing those symptoms and trauma in our community. So that's us and our families and the staff and the system that we're all like involved in. So in terms of that recognition, what impact is recognizing that the signs and symptoms of trauma are all around me? How does this impact and affect my work? So that next R in terms of responding, that's about, now that I have this information, I need to integrate this into the policies and the procedures and the actual things that I am doing when I am working with families. And so having this response, like, why is it really valuable to me as a provider to have this trauma-informed response? How does it make the work that I'm doing when I'm working with others better? How does this improve my engagement? And that last R is resisting re-traumatization, and that should be well understood that we would want to resist re-traumatizing not only our clients, but also ourselves. And so what does that benefit? If somebody comes to us as services and then it's a traumatizing in service, a lot of people already don't seek services because of the trauma associated with that. And so that would be one of the big things that we would want to do in terms of for our clients, but then also in terms of we want to resist re-traumatizing ourselves. One of the things that was in the chat a lot was compassion fatigue, stress. That question about like worrying about like those COVID questions. We want to make sure that we can actually do our best work. And if we're in a traumatized state, then we won't be able to be helpful to our clients, but then also to ourselves.
Thanks, Kynetta. I want to give a simple example about how we start to understand some trauma-informed care principles, but then the important thing is to change your response. So for instance, I was saying to you that a lot of times if kids behave aggressively, we just see that as bad behavior that needs to be punished, or they need to be isolated from their peers because they're acting that way. But that is a response that needs to be shifted. It needs to be shifted to interrupting that behavior and working with the kid to make sure that he feels safe enough to have authentic responses and activities that aren't aggressive, teaching him other ways of responding as opposed to just thinking some sort of behavior chart is going to take care of this. And so it's not just about knowing what these 4 R's are. It's allowing the recognition of these 4 R's to change how you deal with things. And another thought I want to toss in there before I go to Kynetta's next slide, and that is, some of you may be sitting there thinking, I thought we were going to learn about racism, and you are. But we're spending a lot of time helping you frame everything within trauma-informed care because you know how divisive it is out there. People get angry at each other because they have differing opinions and they get polarized in how they see things. And even in the course of this session, we want you to follow the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Recognize what you're seeing and hearing, respond very kindly and supportively, and think that way of yourself as well.
All right. So now we're going to look at the 6 guiding principles of SAMHSA for trauma-informed care. Now, these 6 guiding principles are in addition to the 4 R's. And so it is important to know both of these in terms of having all of these things to be able to guide what is trauma-informed care. And as we can see, if we look at this, if you keep clicking through the different ones, as she keeps popping them up, we'll see that those 4 R's that we talked about, they are central to these 6 guiding principles. So now I'm going to go through and talk about those 6 principles. So the first one on the top, I think, is one of the most important in terms of working with traumatized people: safety. And so that we feel safe, that the people that we're working with feel safe. And so when we're saying safe, we're talking about in terms of physical safety, emotional safety, and psychological safety. And that recognizing that safety is the foundation in terms of trauma-informed care and making trauma-informed environment and trauma-informed practices. The next area is trust and transparency. And so that means like the decisions that I'm making in terms of like when I'm working individually with a family, but also the operations of the organization that I'm a part of, all of that should be open. All of that should be transparent. And so trust and transparency is something in terms of trauma-informed care that's very important. We want to build this trust between staff, clients, and all the family members that are receiving services. The next area is peer support. And so in terms of peer support, that looks at taking team approaches towards things, understanding that peer supports is like one of the fundamental things in terms of resilience, in terms of being able to feel that you can build trust with others, in terms of feeling like that you can have a sense of safety, and also feeling empowerment. And that one of the things in terms of really thinking about trauma-informed care is how much healing happens when you feel that you can share like your experience, where you can feel that you are sharing your viewpoint with another person. So peer support is something that is very, very important in terms of trauma-informed care. The next area, collaboration and mutuality. So collaboration in terms of us having a partnering together, but also making sure that we're aware of power differentials and making sure that we are leveling power differentials in relationships. Most of my clients call me Kynetta. Like a lot of people can get like really caught up on like the fact of like that I am Dr. Kynetta. And so when I'm doing trauma-informed care, one of the things that I want my clients to understand is in terms of, is that I may know like all the psych stuff, but I'm not an expert to your life. I am not an expert to the stuff that works with you. So we want to be aware that we're partnering with others, but that we're also being aware of those power differences and trying to level them. And that recognizing again that that healing happens within the context of relationships, and that we have to share power and decision-making in terms of if we want trauma-informed relationships. The next area, oh, that's cool. The next area, empowerment of voice and choice. So one of the things in terms of is so important in terms of trauma-focused care is that it is strength-based care, and that we are identifying and looking for people's strengths, and that we're recognizing them and validating them. And that recognizing their strengths helps to build their own internal resilience, which helps them to be able to heal with and deal with the effects of trauma. And so we want to build on like their strengths and what others around them can offer versus just having like a focus on the negatives. So not just focusing on a child's dysregulating behavior that looks dysregulating for everybody else, but is just him seeking safety. Am I seeing the strength and am I adding that into like how I see this child and how like I express and how that power that I want to give them back. And then another area that we're looking at is cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so one of the things in terms of trauma-informed care is being aware of like cultural stereotypes and biases and trying to like address them. And also being able to recognize that different communities and different cultures have different ways of healing, and trying to bring that healing into the work that we're doing with other families. And also recognizing that we are a country that is right now dealing with lots of historical traumas. So being also trying to address those things inside of our interactions is also part of trauma-informed care. And so this whole thing that we see leads to stronger families. And so when we have stronger families, we have parental resilience. So this is that, that's that tug in terms of like, that's where we have like the parents being able to bounce back. We have increased social connections. We have families who feel like they have knowledge of like parenting skills and also of their child's development. We have concrete support in times when we're having difficulties. And then we also increase the social and emotional competence in children. So in order to understand what actions like will get us to like this overall goal to like trauma-informed like engagement, we need to start thinking about these questions. So the first question is, what individual experiences combined with cultural and historical issues might influence a family's engagement? Behavior has meaning, and that meaning may be different than what we have assumed. What is another meaning that's possible that we're not even taking into consideration? Developing new responses based on those new understandings. That's just what Bobbi was talking about. When I recognize that this is a kid that seems activated when people get in their face, do we try a different intervention or do we do the same thing? Am I using my privilege as a doctor who can say that certain things happen to others? Am I using that privilege to make better experiences for people? And then that last area, are we committing to do our part to change families' experiences with our agency or with our system? Are we also committed to doing our part to change each other's experiences? Because this is not just based on just the families in terms of trauma-informed engagement. I'm also thinking about my coworkers. Are we looking at what are we doing inside of our agency or system to change things? And so let's start to explore some of these experiences that our families have. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take 10 minutes and we're going to ask you to go to the website playspent.org, and there's an activity there that's related to income inequalities that we would like for you to participate in. It should take you about 10 minutes.
I'm hoping it takes closer to 5.
Yeah.
The website is right there on the screen, but it is playspent.org/ and then hit continue to spent. And it has a little online activity for you to do, and you'll get a score, or you'll have a certain number of days that you last. So go ahead and do the activity. In about 3 or 4 minutes, people should start coming back and telling us their score. You can put your score into the chat.
And then we'll have a little combo about it.
Can you put the full link in the chat?
It is. Oh, I'm sorry. Playspent.org. Dani put it into the chat.
It's not there as a link. I can't click on it. It doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to make it hyperlinked, but I can try to grab it. So hang on.
Thanks, Dani.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Bernie.
Yeah, it came up like at the same time.
So do we click accept the challenge to play?
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye, Janet. Everybody, it's been an hour. It's time to take a deep breath in and out.
Wow. Bobbi, I have a squirrel that keeps coming right up to the window behind me. like he's interested in giving and leading one of the sections.
All right, we got some people starting to come back in.
Great.
These are some of our early finishers.
Indeed. The kind ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wasn't. I didn't feel so kind.
Uh-oh. Maisie thinks this activity is their life.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what the number means again.
Days.
How many days you survive?
Oh, that's why they're back with 5s and 7s.
Yes.
Yeah.
The ones who are still out there, are, the ones sacrificing grandma so that they can pay rent, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. 2 more minutes, everybody. We'll give you to see how long you last. And Kynetta and Dani, I'm going to skip right through to Dani's activity.
Okay.
All right.
So from the people who came back, any observations in terms of completing this activity?
All right, we're having some people who lasted a little longer now. Day 16 so far.
So far, 16 is our longest day.
Sugar, my observation is that as I was doing it, I was thinking of my parents actually and the decisions that they made, and they had fairly, strong financial decision-making tools, which I inherited.
I remember feeling like so many of the decisions, like neither one of them is a win. Like I felt like I just couldn't win. Another person noticed sacrificing the time between making money or being present and providing for your children. It challenges you to think about what's right in very challenging situations. I'm still going, but it's so sad to think of how often my family has had to make these decisions. After recently paying $3,000 for my dog's vet bills this summer, I'm not giving him up. It's hard to justify what you need when you have others' needs to consider.
All righty.
I think one of the things that always brings home for me is just how one event or bad luck, a couple events of bad luck can make the difference between surviving and not.
Yeah. And how so many people, it's like that one domino just drops over and it just knocks everything else down.
All right. I hope most of you are back, because we need to get moving.
All right.
You're up.
All right, so let's get moving. We are going to do a little activity that is going to be all about being able to focus on what I'm asking you to focus on. So for this activity, what I'd like you to do is grab a phone or a stopwatch or something that can measure your time. If you don't have anything close, that's okay. And what I'm going to do is show you the screen, and I want you to name the colors. Don't read the words, but say the color of the word and time yourself. See how fast you can go through this.
I see you doing it, Dani.
I did it just to see how long. Anyone want to throw how many seconds it took them into the chat? And yes, this is not a good activity for those who are colorblind, not all that inclusive for sure. We hear about it all the time because all of Bobbi's brothers are colorblind. And we play a lot of games. All right, so you guys did pretty well. 10, 11, 12. I see 8.23 is one of the best I see out there. All right, so we're going to do this one more time. So reset your timers. And again, I want you to say the color of the word, not what the actual word is like the letters, but the color of the word, and time yourself again. Go ahead.
Everybody ready? Go.
I didn't mean to mute. Sorry, I was trying to mute myself.
All right, so I'm seeing 18, 21, 23, 25. So definitely a little bit longer this time going through for people. And so why do we think that is? Go ahead and move forward, Bob. So this is called the Stroop effect. Some of you may have seen similar activities to this before. So the first chart was completely aligned and the colors all matched the words, but it was much more difficult to do the second slide. And this is called the Stroop effect. It is named after J. Ridley Stroop, who discovered the strange phenomenon in the 1930s. the words themselves have a strong influence over your ability to say the color. And so there's interference in your brain. Your brain is trying to figure out which is going to have primacy or be most important. And so this causes the problem. And what these two theories around this that may explain the Stroop effect, one of them is the speed of processing theory, because the interference happens because we're better at reading than at saying colors out loud. Our brains are just faster that way. And another may be selective attention theory, because naming colors requires you to pay more attention, and our brains, like everything else in the universe, are going to try to find the easiest path forward. So either way, we know that without careful attention to the task, our strongest association will interfere with what we know to be true. So your brain sometimes will get in your way to find the easiest way towards new information. And we'll come back to the Stroop effect a little bit more as we go through the presentation today.
All right, so we've identified a few barriers to engagement. Thanks for throwing those in the chat. There's certainly a lot of factors that lead to these barriers. And now we're going to switch our lens in this training to, for the remainder of this time, to understand the intersection of trauma, race, bias, and behavior. So we're going to dive into a little bit more trauma. When and how did we become aware of all this trauma? It was the ACE study. The ACE study was the largest scientific research study of its kind in the early 1990s. It was analyzing the relationship between multiple categories of childhood trauma and the long-term health and behavioral outcomes later in life. One of the biggest eye-openers from the ACE study was the inclusion of household dysfunction. These items are not directly about the child's behavior, but the experiences of their family or their household, reinforcing for all of us that context matters. Remember, the ACE study created the foundational link between adverse childhood experiences and lifelong impact. Let's see if there's anything else. I think that's all I need to say on this slide. These are the 10 original categories in the ACE study. However, there's some things that are missing. Anybody want to think about what those might be? I would give you time to respond in the chat, but I'm going to keep plowing through this so we can get to our next section. Some of the things that are acknowledged as missing in current research is school and community violence. It's not specifically listed on the ACE study, and definitely that is a traumatizing kind of experience. Disasters and accidents. So I think about natural disasters like hurricanes and tsunamis and things like that, and then man-made accidents like car wrecks and having your house burned down. Also traumatizing. Invasive or prolonged medical procedures, discrimination and oppression, and now we're getting close to the intersection here, and poverty, okay? Because the level of privilege in the original study, everybody who was in that study was well employed and well insured. They didn't think about this other list of traumas. Okay, they just didn't have to deal, they never asked about poverty. Even if the person had grown up in poverty, they went on then to have a good job and to be well insured. And so a lot of these things were missing because it just didn't really strike the population of the original ACE study group that responded to the survey. But they are absolutely included now and are pretty well researched. So now, instead of thinking about simply having 10 categories of trauma in the ACE study, you need to have at least 15 and add these 5 new areas. So now our next poll is, what percentage of people, youth, or families do I serve who might have 4 or more traumas? Because the trick to the ACE study and what it taught us was it doesn't matter how many times you had one of the categories. What really matters is how many different categories of trauma you experience. And the more categories of trauma you experience, the more likely you are to have negative long-term outcomes. So I'm going to hit that poll for us real quick. I think poll 2, here we go. So what percentage of people do you think have 4 or more of those 15 categories? Oh, good. You guys are answering fast now. Few more responses. 80% have voted. And we'll call it right there. 83% of people have voted. Here's your results. So people are looking, the biggest amount, 23%, say that up to 80% of their clients have 4 or more, okay? And it really, of course, depends on what field you're in. If you're in behavioral health care, the likelihood is that you're over 90%. If you're working at some camp that's super privileged, with a group of super privileged people, then you might be down in the 20%. But the truth is, a lot of people have a significant amount of trauma, and we just want to keep that in mind. So let's take a dip here for a minute about what kind of trauma. How do these break down? Because we don't really look at trauma as 15 different categories. That's just how they survey for them. The first kind of trauma we'll look at is acute trauma, and that's a discrete event. So an acute trauma, as awful as it might be, has a beginning and an end. So somebody might be raped, and that's horrid and a horrible violation, but it does have a distinct beginning and an end. It's over. Compare that to chronic trauma, which is about repeated and prolonged exposure. So chronic trauma is living in a home with domestic violence. Chronic trauma is being in a marginalized population and the stress of the microaggressions and being put down or oppressed. Another, and probably the single biggest chronic trauma, is poverty. And then we get things complicated because people don't just have one of these, and complex trauma means that you have varied and multiple types of trauma and exposure. And a lot of times, if you're in the behavioral health field, you're working with complex trauma. It's unusual that somebody would come to you with just a single discrete clear trauma to work on, okay? So I just wanted you to get a little higher level of looking at trauma and the 3 sorts that it breaks down into. One more thing I'd like to go through with you about trauma is that when you have 4 or more, and we just surveyed you about that, when you have 4 or more trauma categories, it disrupts how your neurodevelopment goes, okay? In very specific ways. We know exactly how that disruption occurs now. And the other thing we know about trauma is what fires together, wires together. So if you are, whatever your 5 senses are detecting when you're being traumatized, those all lay the groundwork for you to be triggered by those sensations later in life. So let's say that while domestic violence was occurring in your home, you're a child, they didn't even have to be touching you, but you could hear the chaos and the threats of domestic violence. And while that was happening, you were making popcorn. So the smell or the sound of popcorn popping becomes a trigger for you later in life to feel agitated and uneasy because that was wired together with violence. Another thing is when you have 4 or more trauma categories, you begin to overinterpret threat, which leads to overreacting to things in your life. A common example I give for this are kids in the foster care system who hoard. They hoard food and they hoard things because they're over-interpreting the potential threat of not having something. And so their brain is compelling them to hide things and to keep things so that they don't have to worry about that. But boy, it drives those foster parents crazy. And then when you overreact, as I've said several times, the most common go-to response is punishment, which exacerbates their shame, escalates their trauma response, and in no way helps to resolve or calm them down. So here's a quote by Maya Angelou. Do your best until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. So we're hoping with all of this information, we're giving you things so you can know better and think about different ways to manage people who might exhibit some of those responses in terms of trauma. All right, so now we're going to get to the next part, which is race. What part might race play in barriers to engagement? How do we recognize the issues around race in America? And one way to look at it is by examining racial equity. So from the Civil Rights Act in 1964 to the Black Lives Matter movement here in 2020, some people think we're making progress and others disagree. Many people think it's a matter of opinion, but I want to remind you that opinion includes personal knowledge and lived experience, and so opinion does count. And I have one more poll for you here this afternoon, and let me set that up. Poll 3, racial equity in America, and or wherever you are, do you think it's better, worse, or the same as it was back in the 1960s? And whichever answer you give, put your evidence or your opinion about it in the chat. Why do you think it's better or worse or the same? $80 people, 66% voted. Let's see if we can get a few more in here. 90. And I have to say, we're pretty split here. Wow, pretty darn close, actually. 99 people have weighed in on this. Now 100. Okay, I'm going to end the polling. Give me a couple more seconds to put it in there. And share the results. So 40% of us think it's about the same as it was in the 60s. So that's a little disheartening, right? We're 40 years past that, and we haven't made any progress. There are a few people, 27%, think that we are better off than we were, and 34% think we're worse. I'm going to close that down for now. Kynetta, we got anything going on in the chat? Okay. Nobody wants to say what they're thinking about in terms of evidence of this, but I do want you to just to think about it in your head. What is the evidence for being better, worse, or the same?
I'm seeing some things being shared about.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, some things are being shared about, like, people do know better, but don't necessarily do better. There's more overt racism right now, I'm seeing. In reality, it could be both. There's so much going on that there's a lot to think about. Equality may be slightly better, but equity definitely still is not on par. So some people looking at some of the different, kind of digging in there a little bit. Lots of discussion around systemic issues that are coming more to be visible now than they have in the past.
All righty. I'm going to go ahead and move into the next segment of our program, which I like very much, and all of you out there in the AEE world, I hope you appreciate, because it's a big metaphor. And we tend to be fond of our metaphors. So here we go. Let's imagine you have a lake in front of your house, and one fish is floating belly up dead. It makes sense to analyze that fish. What's wrong with it? Imagine that that fish is one student failing in the education system. We'd begin asking, what's wrong with that student? Did it study hard enough? Did they get the support they need at home? And we'd be correct if there's just one person having problems or just one fish floating in that lake. But what if you came out of your house to that same lake and half the fish are floating belly up dead? Now what do we do? This isn't a one student problem. We would now say, instead of analyzing that one fish, it's time to analyze the lake. What's wrong with this lake? What could cause half of the fish in this lake to die? If this lake was your education system, for instance, we would ask, what's wrong with this system? What's wrong with our education system? And how could it be causing half of its students to not do well or to not pass?
Mm-hmm.
Let's extend the metaphor even further. Now you have 5 different lakes. I'm fond of this metaphor because, of course, I live near the Great Lakes, 5 lakes. And so the whole thing rings for me. But 5 lakes with half of their fish dead. Now it's time to analyze the groundwater. How did contamination spread to 5 different lakes? How did the water in all these lakes end up with the same contamination? On the surface, the lakes don't even appear to be connected, but it's possible, even likely, that they are very connected. In fact, over 95% of the fresh water on the planet is not above ground. Where we can see it, it's below the surface in the groundwater. Now imagine that half the kids in the United States are failing in the education system. Half the kids are suffering from ill health. Half are performing poorly in the criminal justice system. Half are struggling economically. And it's often the same kids in each system who are struggling. In my work, we call those MSY, multi-system youth. Why, folks, is racial inequality across all systems, and how might our systems actually be connected? By using a groundwater approach, one might begin to ask these questions. Why are educators creating the same racial inequality as doctors, who are creating the same racial inequality as police officers, who are creating the same racial inequality as child welfare workers? How are these systems all connected? Most importantly, how do we use our position in any one of these systems to impact a structural and racial arrangement that might be deeper than any one system? This metaphor was put forward by the Racial Equity Institute. They created this groundwater metaphor to help us understand the reality that we live in a racially structured society, and that is what causes racial inequity. Instead of saying, what's wrong with you, when somebody struggles in any one of our systems, we should be saying, what's happened to you, and understand that we're dealing with structural racism. So structural racism perpetuates racial group inequity. They use policies, practices, cultural representations, and all of other norms in various ways to perpetuate these inequities. It's a little overwhelming and it's a little difficult, but I want you to hear this loud and clear. There are dimensions in our history and our culture that allows privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. It's not just something that happened a long time ago and we're past it. We're not post-racist. Structural racism is not something that only a few people or certain institutions choose to practice. Instead, it's been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. So some of the groundwater metaphor observations include that racial inequity looks the same across all the systems, that socioeconomic difference does not explain the racial inequity, and that inequalities are caused by systems. So we're going to dig into these observations and see what we know about it. By the way, we're going to run about 5 to 10 minutes past 3:30 when you should be having your break. But I don't want to stop in the middle of this metaphor work. And so we're going to finish this up in the next few minutes. Hang in there with me, and we'll give you a full 15-minute break. So the third observation is that inequalities are caused by the systems themselves. Racial inequity looks the same across systems. This is a chart that tells us the likelihood of people of color having bad outcomes compared to whites in the United States. So for you, those of you from other places, Canada and other countries, this is what it looks like here. You may have similar kinds of information where you live, but we're going to use this information to show that if a white person has a problem with, for instance, infant death is his first line, the Black person is 2.5 times more likely to have infant death. Or death from diabetes, twice as likely as white people. Having a below proficient score in 4th grade, half as likely, 1.5 times as likely. But now we're going to start hiking up here. If a white person is suspended during K through 12, 3.5 times as many Black people are suspended during their school years. If a white person is searched in a routine traffic stop, 2.5 times are likely that the Black people are searched. And here is the highlight of this slide. Incarceration as an adult. For every white person who's incarcerated as an adult, 7 times as many Black people are incarcerated. And it gets even more stunning when you think about the fact that Black people are not 7 times more, we don't have 7 times the population in the United States of Black people. As a matter of fact, does anybody know what the current percentage is? I want to say, I'm not even going to guess because I'm afraid I'll be wrong. Somebody want to check for me, Dani or Kynetta? What's the percentage of Blacks in America right now?
Around 14, I believe, is where we were. Somebody put in 13, but
okay.
That's
yeah, we're usually 13 to 14% of the population.
So so you can just see how disparate this becomes when you start looking at the percentage of the population. It's even worse. Other things that are identified are identified as a victim in child welfare, twice as likely. In foster care, just over twice as likely. Denied a loan, 5 times as likely to be denied a loan if you're Black. And you don't own your own home. You're twice as likely to not own your own home. And so while it's not the exact same number across the entire scope of these issues here, it exists in all of the systems. There's no system where the playing field is leveled. We could look at the same exact data, only it changes it to if Black people are having that issue, what percentage, of problem is it for white people? And so if 100 Black people are incarcerated, we're down here at about 16, 17 people, white people incarcerated. Those are huge disparities. The space between these two lines is referred to as the white advantage. All right, I'm gonna move us into here and say that racial inequity looks the same across systems. Not the exact same numbers, but it's happening in all of our systems. But the questions start to pop up like maybe it's not race, but socioeconomic difference that explains it. And when we come back after the break, we're going to dig into some of these details to see, do these observations in the groundwater metaphor hold true when we dip into the research and into the media? So for now, we're going to take a 15-minute break. It's 3:34. We will start again at 3:50. Okay, so at 3:50 we'll start again. I strongly encourage you to do something on this slide for yourself rather than sitting there and answering your emails or returning a work call. I'm looking at you. Don't do it. Have a good break. All right, everybody, welcome back. And here we go. Dani, I think you're up.
I am up. All right, so Bobbi left us with the question before break asking, does socioeconomic difference explain the racial inequity that we're seeing across these multiple systems? So we're going to look at the impact of race and wealth on incarceration, on maternal and infant death rates, on name type and resume callback, so we'll take a look at it in the workplace, and then also race and college selectivity in the labor market. So we're going to show some different examples of each of these inequities and break down whether we're looking at socioeconomic difference or if race is the specific factor. All right, so this is a very busy slide, so before you try to dig into it too hard, let me explain a little bit about this one. So in 2016, William Darity and team from Duke looked at a national longitudinal survey of youth that began in 1979, and it followed a group of young people into adulthood and middle age. The participants were asked about their assets and debts, and then they noted their type of residence, including whether they were in jail or prison at the time. They then researchers grouped the participants in the survey by their race and their household wealth as of 1985, and then looked back through the data to see how many people in each group ultimately went to prison. Go ahead, Bob. So overall, white men in the poorest wealth deciles were less likely to be incarcerated than Black men in the wealthiest deciles. So this is what this ultimately is showing us, is that rich Black kids are still more likely to go to prison than even the poorest whites. So about 2.7% of the poorest white young people, those whose household wealth was in the poorest 10th of the distribution in 85, when they were between 20 and 28 years old, ultimately went to prison. In the next 10th, or the next decile, 3.1% ultimately went to prison. And then if you're looking at about 10% of affluent Black youth in 1985 would eventually go to prison. Only the very wealthiest Black youth, those whose household wealth in 85 exceeded $69,000, had a better chance of avoiding prison than the poorest white youth. Among the Black young people in this group, 2.4% were incarcerated. We do have Hispanic participants included in this as well, and those who were less affluent were more likely to eventually be incarcerated than their white peers with similar wealth, but less likely than Black participants. So for Latino and Hispanic participants, they were somewhere in the middle. What's more, even young Black people who follow the rules and are never incarcerated are less likely than similar white people to accumulate wealth as they get older. As of 2012, the median household wealth of Black participants in this study who had never been incarcerated, so never been in jail, was $16,200. Those who had been incarcerated had zero wealth. In comparison, the white participants who had never been incarcerated had $192,000 accumulated, and the white participants who had been incarcerated showed a reported wealth of $5,000. So it could be that the white participants still had other advantages, even if they had been incarcerated. Maybe they had better schools, those types of things. But ultimately what this is showing is that even when you're taking wealth out of the equation, that we're still seeing a big disparity in terms of just the race of the participants. All right, so this is a Miami doctor, made the news a little while ago. We're trying to pull in some more current events here. So Dr. Armin Henderson, who is on the right here, and volunteer Lisa Hameen Carver talked to a symptomatic homeless man, and this is April 3rd of 2020. They're doing outreach, they're doing COVID testing. They're in the homeless population of Miami, which is the Overtown neighborhood. At that time, this is what you may have heard about, was that Henderson, the doctor, was detained and handcuffed by a Miami police sergeant in front of his own home in an incident caught on video. According to the police chief, the local sergeant was responding to a lot of complaints pertaining to illegal dumping in the area. The officer said he spotted the doctor's cargo van from which it appeared trash was being offloaded, so he stopped to investigate. So Dr. Henderson had a surgical face mask on. He was loading supplies into his white van and placing trash on the sidewalk nearby. The officer pulls up in his car, speaks to Henderson, gets out and puts him in handcuffs and stands face to face with him speaking. Henderson was released from the handcuffs only when his wife was able to come out and return home to retrieve identification. So this is one example of how race sometimes can be an issue and can present itself, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in the through the police and in some of the justice system. And it also shows some of the immediate biases. Another piece to this is that Dr. Henderson also has accused them of putting his life at risk because while he was wearing a mask, none of the police officers had been, and that same police unit had just had a COVID outbreak recently. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more now about the disparities in some different healthcare situations. So first on infant mortality. So a lot of studies have shown that after controlling for education and socioeconomic status, African American women remain at higher risk for both maternal and infant mortality. So if you control for income, gestational age, maternal age, if you control for a lot of these other factors, the odds of dying from pregnancy or delivery complications were almost 3 times higher for African American women than they were for non-Hispanic white women. And another showed that college-educated African American women were almost 3 times as likely to lose their infants as their similarly educated non-Hispanic white peers. So in this situation, you're seeing that education and other factors, health factors alone did not account for these disparities in both the mortality issues with both the mothers and the infants in these scenarios. There's a few other situations where you may have heard about these in the news. One is Erica Garner. Eric Garner was her father who was killed in one of the first high-profile killings by police back in 2014. And she had a heart attack, and after the stress of a pregnancy, it weakened her heart, weakened it. She ended up dying in December of 2017. And then another example is Serena Williams, which some people may have read about as well. Despite the fact that she's one of the, most famous people on earth and very well respected, very educated, and very definitely has a lot of money, still had a near-death experience when she gave birth and was ignored by some of the doctors that she was working with at the time, as you have probably heard some about. You can go on, Bob. All right, so here's some key findings. And looking from 2007 to 2016, we're looking at data on pregnancy-related mortality. So this is maternal death we're looking at in this scenario. So first of all, it should be really concerning to people that our mortality rates for our pregnant mothers has actually increased over time from 15 to 17 pregnancy-related deaths. But even within that, Black women experience 3.2 times higher than women. Native women and Alaska Native and Indigenous peoples experience 2.3 times higher rate. And then as you get older, you'll see it even higher, some of the disparities that you'll see here based on race. And so overall, we're getting worse with maternal mortality, and we are also seeing great disparities between people of color and white people in terms of what the actual mortality risk for the women was. Go ahead, Bob. All right, so the next thing that we are going to talk about is resume callbacks. So we're going to switch gears for a little bit. We were talking about some of the disparities in healthcare outcomes, and now we're going to talk about some of the employment disparities that you may see. And this is actually some of what my background is in, because I've done a lot of work in recruiting for a diverse workforce. So this particular study that was done, this was by researchers at Harvard and the University of Chicago. And so what they did is they were looking at the employment based on some of the different resumes that were sent in. So what they did, they responded with fictitious resumes to help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago. So they responded with 4 resumes, 1 white and 1 black, or I should say 2 white resumes, 1 with a high quality and 1 with a black high quality, and then also with average quality and average quality for a black person. So those were the 2 variables, were high quality versus low quality and white versus black. And then just to tell you, the higher quality applicants had a little bit more experience, fewer holes in their employment history, more likely to have an email address, all around just better resumes there. And they responded to over 1,300 employment ads and sent in nearly 5,000 resumes. So that sets up what this study did. Go ahead, Bob. And so the results, the white names would receive 50% more callbacks for interviews. A white name yields as many more callbacks as an additional 8 years of experience if you're looking at the differences between these resumes. White name, higher quality resumes receive 30% more callbacks than the white name average quality resumes, and black name higher quality resumes receive just slightly more callbacks than black name average quality. And so in this situation, it looks like basically just being white is actually getting you more callbacks than even having potentially 8 years more experience in the field, which is pretty disappointing. Oh, and I always want to add in there, so when I was working in the field, we had a lot of different strategies to combat this. Some of the things we even did were taking the names off of resumes before we would give them to the managers to look at, to try to even the playing field a little bit more wherever it was possible. And there's a lot of different things that you can do to try to both be aware of the bias and to try to find ways to keep your own biases from affecting your decision making there. All right, so this is a, let's see, where are ya? There's a belief in our society that education can be the great equalizer, and it's supposed to help us overcome different social disadvantages. I think this is, a lot of people have this in their belief system, that if we can just equalize the playing field around education, that would go a long way to help us move forward. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But in some studies, they will show that even having a better education, even going to a better school, is not necessarily going to help you when you actually get out there into the workforce. So in this situation, what they did was, let me go on. Actually, move on to the next slide for me, Bob. So what they did, they looked at the employment opportunities for white and black graduates of elite universities versus less selective institutions. So this is looking at, you know, the difference between a Harvard and a state school type of thing. Does the elite name on your resume make any difference? And they wanted to see if there's still racial economic equality among the college educated, if racial difference made a difference there. So they applied for 1,008 jobs on a national job search website using matched candidate pairs. So they would have white and black graduates of equal qualification and standing. And then the results. So black candidates from elite universities only do as well as white candidates from less selective universities. Employers respond to the Black candidates with jobs with lower starting salaries and lower prestige than those of the white peers. So in this situation, it showed that if you're Black, even a bachelor's degree from an elite university cannot fully counteract the importance of race in the labor market. Go ahead. So these are just a few examples. There's a ton of research out there about these differences, but these are just a few examples of how even when you're trying to equalize for socioeconomic difference, it does not always explain the racial inequity that we will see. We looked at this on incarceration and things having to do with the justice system, on wealth and maternal and infant death, on resume callbacks in the employment world, and then also college selectivity in the labor market. And all of this ultimately showed that, that race still seems to be impacting in those areas. All right, Bob, I'm going to pass it back to you now.
All right, thank you. So there's a common narrative that inequities are explained by culture or behavioral differences. So together we're going to explore 3 more examples of the inaccuracy of this narrative. The education system and discipline, the medical system and the quality of care, and the financial system and lending policies. So we're going to take a peek at these 3 things to see if we can explain it through other factors besides race. All right. Oh, I forgot about this. We have a quick video to show you, and let me, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So hang on and think about what you've just seen there. And
well, actually, it's 4 o'clock. Everybody go ahead and take a deep breath.
Thanks, Kynetta. Sorry, I should have had this preloaded, and I apologize.
There's a new study out of the Yale.
In addition, I need to make sure you can hear it. So if you can't hear it, tell me right away, and I will.
When you just played it, I could hear it.
Could you?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me share it. Where am I?
Child Study Center, but I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing, a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. And here's the trick, there was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and black alike, spent the most time watching the black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class. Pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. Researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a black child, or even a black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool. Well, imagine where else that's true.
By the way, we have those links for you as well, and you'll get them in your handouts this afternoon when we send them out. What are you seeing now, Kynetta?
You're back to the presentation.
Great, thank you. Sometimes I lose my way back. So this isn't just a bigger cultural issue. This is down in our preschool, and that he ends it on such a poignant note. If we're having this much trouble looking at 4-year-olds, how much more difficult is it for adults in our system? So researchers used that eye tracking thing, and they could tell that preschool teachers spent 42% of their time watching the Black boys and far less time in any of the other categories. But I also want you to note that it's a different kind of discrimination, but they hardly pay attention to the Black girls at all compared to the other kids. And so it's just not equal. It's not equitable how they look at this. Researchers speculate that Black educators might be demonstrating a belief that Black children require harsh assessment and discipline to prepare them for a very harsh world. Kynetta, you have a point in here about Black people. Go ahead.
In terms of is this the prison to school pipeline? I don't know.
Yes, I mean, this is the beginning of the prison to school pipeline, of course, but in a
the other big thing about is in terms of like when we see like how the Black teachers were also looking at the Black males, a lot of that has to do with like internalized racism that I can believe, even though I believe positive things about Black people. I was raised in this society, and I also got all those silent messages about who to fear and who's the troublemaker. So even though I'm Black and can think positive things about myself, I can still have all those like internalized thoughts and belief systems, and it can show itself in my behavior.
Thanks, Kynetta. So ultimately, the tendency to base classroom observation on the gender and race of the child may explain in part why those children are more frequently identified as misbehaving, and hence why there is a racial disparity in discipline. And we're about to look at that. So inequities are caused by systems, and this is the educational system, but specifically we're only looking at preschool students here. And this comes from the Civil Rights Data Collection, and it's a representative sample of the nation's students in the United States. Preschool discipline, the inclusion for the first time in this data confirms that discipline begins in the earliest years of schooling. Of the school districts with children participating in preschool programs, 6% reported suspending out of school at least one preschool child. Racial disparities in those out of school suspensions start very early. Black children represent 18% of preschool attendance, right here in the first column to the left. 18% of enrollment, but 42% of the children suspended once, and 48% of the preschool children who are suspended more than once. You can see the other data too. So whites are the largest percent enrolled, but then they drop significantly, almost by half, for out of school suspension for single or multiple. Hispanics are another area we could look at. They are 29% of the enrollees, about 25% of single suspensions, and 20% of multiple suspensions. So it just doesn't look good, particularly for Black students. And again, this is starting at age 3 and 4. So more data from the Civil Rights Data Collection. And the total sample size, by the way, is 49 million students. Okay. And you can track the same thing on this data graph. Black students represent 16%. of the student population, but 32% up to 42% of in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, out-of-school suspension for multiple days. And even expulsions are double, more than double the number for the percentage who are enrolled. Black students are suspended and expelled at a rate of 3 times greater than white students. On average, 4.6% of white students are suspended compared to 16.4% of Black students. We can also explore suspensions by race and by gender, but Black boys and girls have higher suspension rates than any of their peers. 20% of Black boys and more than 12% of Black girls receive out-of-school suspensions. So when you can't manage a kid by punishing them in school, suspending them out of school, even multiple times, eventually they turn to expulsion. And so this last slide is all, well, and even if expulsion doesn't seem like enough for them, they refer to outside law enforcement and have school-related arrests. And once again, the Black students start out at about 16% of the enrollees. It nearly doubles for the number who are referred to law enforcement and school-related arrests. So there are a lot of bad things that can happen to you while you're at school, unfortunately, which is where we should be, you know, engaging and teaching and embracing. But it is definitely disproportionately used. All of these techniques to control or manage people are used much more frequently for Black students. So inequities are caused by symptoms. Here's another, by systems. Here's additional results. So in schools where they have high-level math and science courses, 82% of the majority of our white high schools, they have the lowest Black, Indigenous, and people of color enrollment. 82 offer Algebra 2 versus 65% of the majority Black, Indigenous, people of color schools getting that kind of class. So they don't get the same quality or the same level of classes offered to them. There's also issues with teacher equity. So schools who serve the most people of color students are nearly twice as likely to employ teachers who are newest to the profession. So brand new out of school, we're going to put you at what are considered lower level schools. Teachers in elementary school serving Black, Indigenous, and people of color students are paid on average $2,200 less per year than their colleagues in other schools in the same district who serve the fewest Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So the disparity exists in discipline, the disparity exists in access to high-level classes, and the disparity exists in what they're willing to pay teachers of either race or any race to work with those children.
And if you would like to get some more information about how the criminalization of children starts off in school and then can lead to further problems, there's 2 books, From Preschool to Prison: The Criminalization of Black Girls by Sophia Bahina, and The School to Prison Pipeline by Nancy Hetzig. Both go into more information about that subject.
Thank you, Kynetta. And now I'm going to toss it back to you to look at the healthcare system and those inequities.
So the first study that we're going to talk about looks at some of the healthcare disparities that happen in terms of how is quality of care for people who are minority or who are a non-minority. And so the first thing that they look for in terms of that is that they're looking for the difference in services, but they're not looking at differences that are due to access to care. So a difference in terms of access to care is that I need a therapist, but there's only 5 therapists near me because I'm in a rural area. or not related to like clinical needs. So like, what need does the person have? What's their preference, or like their intervention? So like, I really need like a DBT, so this high intensity therapy, but they don't offer that in my area. So we're not talking about those types of disparities. We're talking about disparities that are due to how the healthcare system operates, or the legal climate that the healthcare system is working in, or discrimination, bias, stereotyping, or uncertainty that really happens on the individual to patient person level. And so I'm going to break that down in the next slide in terms of like, what does that mean a little bit more. So, all right. So in terms of this one, I'm going to talk about this because I'm somebody who used to work in a hospital. So in terms of this is like a model, and talks about, this model is kind of like showing us like how inequalities can show itself in a system. So a person comes in for services to me, and they have lots of different needs. They have certain expectations, and they have preferences based off of like things that they think that should be happening based off of their problems. And then also things that are like normal by like the society, normal within their culture. So they have all that information. Now, me as the clinician, I'm sitting there, and I also have like expectations and beliefs. Some of those are shaped by like my training that I've gotten, the experience that I've had in my trainings, as well as I'm also been shaped by my community and like the culture that I'm a part of. And so we're both bringing both of like this information into this healthcare system, right? And so this system itself that we're bringing it into, they have influences. So one of the things that a healthcare system can be influenced by is the way that it's designed, in terms of like, is it really easy to get like care at that service, or is it difficult? Financial forces, something that I'm sure a lot of us know about, in terms of how often can you see somebody, and then for how long can you see somebody, and then what will you get paid by that provider. So the healthcare system has like all of those like legal and cultural like things shaping them. Then a big part of this model is how like me as a clinician, I have lots of personal discretion. I have personal discretion in terms of how do I interpret information. So if I have a kid that comes in and they're being very disruptive, I can look at that behavior and go, okay, you're having behavior management problems. If I have a trauma-informed lens and I ask questions about that, I can look at that disruptive behavior about like, oh, is this how you're expressing yourself? Are you trying to like be safe by being disruptive to make people get away from you? So I have like discretion in terms of my interpretation. Then there's also discretion in terms of what intervention that I use. So a person comes in for disruptive behavior, there's lots of different ways that I could treat that. I could treat that in a trauma-informed way that I recognize that maybe this is your way of seeking safety, or I can treat this in a, you are just being disruptive and we need to work with you on consequences. So both of those are appropriate based off of that disruptive behavior, but I have a choice based off of my viewpoint, my personal discretion, my belief system of which one, where that should go. And that's where we see the stereotyping and the prejudice that can come together and affect the type of work, the type of belief systems, the type of interpretations, the type of interventions that a person will get in services. Next slide. And so this is going, this slide goes over some of the experience that people of color have had in terms of when they were being seen in healthcare settings. So the first one, being in a group practice, seeing predominantly African-American patients. I have patients who have seen mainly white physicians in the past. When they come in to visit with us and speak with us, something as simple as asking them to sit up on the table. And then they have questions. What are you going to do? The doctor responds, I'm going to examine you. The patient responds, oh, my other doctor never did that. And so this is the experience that an African-American doctor has with his clients. The next one, of course, in psychiatry, we see this discrimination. One area we see it is in terms of diagnosis. Patients are inappropriately diagnosed and medications prescribed for the patients. We see errors in that. Minority patients will often be diagnosed inappropriately as being schizophrenic. A Hispanic physician notes, when I ask my Hispanic patients if the other doctor ever examined you, they say no. They give me a prescription. It's amazing. A lot of times these patients have had these problems, have been missed by other doctors. And so this is a case that made nationwide news at the beginning of COVID, and this is from March of this year. And this is from Newsweek. A Michigan healthcare worker who died with COVID-19 symptoms and developed bilateral pneumonia was reportedly given cough medicine and told to rest at home before being turned away several times from the hospital where she worked. Deborah Gatewood, a 63-year-old health worker at Beaumont Hospital in Farmington Hills in the suburbs of the Detroit metropolitan area, began coughing with a fever in the third week of March, Fox 2 Detroit reports. They, Beaumont, the hospital where she worked at, sent her home saying you are showing signs of COVID, said Kalila Carruthers, her daughter. So they were confirming that she most likely had COVID, but they did not test her. Gatewood was reportedly sent home 4 times from the ER with cough medicine and told to rest, according to Carruthers, who marked the days her mother had gone to seek help at the hospital on a calendar. Gatewood's fever was said to have gotten higher and her symptoms worse each time she went to the ER. By the end of March, Gatewood reportedly developed bilateral pneumonia before she collapsed and was taken by ambulance to Sinai Grace Hospital in Detroit, where she died. All of this time, when you're telling her, the hospital she worked with, to go home and rest it off, how do you really rest off bilateral pneumonia other than cough medicine to cough it out? It's too severe at that point, Carruthers said. The fact that she got infected on a job by doing a job that she did for 31 years and couldn't get taken care of. And so this next area looks at also different areas of how disparities in healthcare happen across a range of conditions. And a lot of it is due to patient.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Kynetta?
Communication. And so there is a pattern of human behavior that includes thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, institutions, racial, ethnic, or social group. And so knowing what somebody's culture is very important in terms of healthcare. And one of the things that we see in terms of what impacts cultural competence in terms of when you're dealing with somebody in the healthcare system is how competent is somebody who the patient is dealing with? How competent are they in terms of what are their culture? And there's 3 big strategies that we look at in terms of how we can improve these cultural communications, this multicultural communication. Because one of the things that we had talked about earlier is how what happens when people of our different cultures are talking to each other, what is the information that they're able to share. And one of the things that we want to look for in terms of institutions is that we want to have institutions that are accommodating in terms of taking into consideration people's competence. We also want to have cultural humility in terms of, cultural homophily, which means I want to take into consideration what are the things that you use in terms of your culture. And then another thing that we want to look at is in terms of direct services. What are the direct services? What are the ways in terms of that me, the provider, and the patient, how do we communicate? One of the things that I know in terms of educational materials, most educational materials that most people get in terms of medical situations are often outside of their ability to be able to read them. Most people can read on average on a 3rd to 4th grade reading level. Most educational materials inside of hospitals are above that. So in terms of easy inequality would be for me to tell somebody to follow up on information and give them a pamphlet and expect for them to be able to leave and then to be able to get that same information. Next slide. So one of the things that we know is that when we have good or poor communication, we have good or poor outcomes. So when I have good communication between me and one of my patients, we see increased satisfaction. When clients are more happy, they're more likely to adhere to treatment recommendations. And if you're more likely to adhere to appropriate treatment recommendations, you're more likely to have positive health outcomes. We also know the opposite happens in terms of poor communication. When you have poor communication, you have more patient dissatisfaction. Therefore, patients are less likely to adhere or to follow up or to believe in the treatment recommendations, and therefore they're more likely to have poor outcomes in terms of their symptoms not improving, but then also in terms of their own outcomes that they wanted to see, that they are seeing that their needs are not being met. So some of the ways that we want to look at in terms of what are some of the recommendations that we have in terms of reducing the healthcare disparities. So one of these things that we want to do is like what we're doing right now is increasing the awareness of racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare among the general public. And then also the key stakeholders are all the people who are involved. So everybody in public, but then also the people who are also working in the system. Another thing is also, as I said, that systemic part, making sure that healthcare providers are aware of those disparities. Other things that can increase that, patient education and empowerment. Looking at like what are like overall like interventions that the health system needs to take at, cross-cultural education in professions, and also making sure that we're collecting data and monitoring how we're doing in these areas. And then finally, making sure that we are putting our research dollars behind looking at these disparities.
Thanks, Kynetta. Dani?
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some financial inequalities and where these inequities may be actually caused by the systems. So this is just the front page of a settlement that relates to the crisis from 2008-2009 when our markets crashed. A lot of the I think thoughts around what happened where there was a lot of people that were in mortgages that they couldn't afford. But there's even more to it if you dig into it, and the racial inequities that were involved there were just astonishing. They were looking back at all of these subprime mortgages. This is specifically around Countrywide Financial Corporation, but they found hundreds of instances where actually it says 200,000 people, African American and Hispanic borrowers were charged higher fees. They were put into subprime mortgages instead of prime mortgages when their credit history was identical to other white applicants, making it much harder for them to be able to actually keep up with payments and be able to pay those back. I'm sure that many of you have looked at some of the other things that played into this, but some of it was actually just subprime mortgages and banks, predatory banking procedures that were happening, which disproportionately affected people of color. And so this is years ago, but some of these effects, if you're looking looking long-term at the recovery from that economic downfall, Black people in general have not been able to recover nearly as quickly and come back out of this because of a lot of these racist practices. So this is just another example of where the system itself is actually hurting people. And I don't know if you've seen recently, there's been a lot of discussion, at least here in Ohio, mostly because there's been some studies done showing property values, when property values are being assessed. In fact, there was one specific one that made the news where there was a Black couple who felt that their home value was it was under what they thought it should be worth. And so they took out all of the pictures of their Black relatives and replaced it with white relatives and had it reappraised, and it appraised for roughly $100,000 more than it had the first time. Same house, same district. I think this is down in Bexley or Worthington, down in the Columbus area, but that's one that got some heat around here. But all this goes to show that a lot of these racial disparities that you're seeing are built into the systems in different ways in terms of how we're actually giving people loans, how we're valuing different people's homes, that type of thing. And that doesn't even get us into redlining, which we will dig into quite a bit next week in this training. You can go to the next slide, Bob. So inequities are caused by these systems. They cannot be explained by cultural or behavioral differences. And you could see this in the education system where you saw kids who were behaving in exactly the same ways. Nobody's misbehaving. People are still watching more, those students of color. In the medical system and the way people are cared for in the medical system, which I think COVID has brought into stark relief over the last 6 months or so. And then also in our financial and lending systems and how racial injustice is also baked into those systems.
So, system inequities. Is it possible that the people you serve experience some sort of inequity? And is it possible that inequity exists inside the system that you work? So we're going to have one more breakout. Don't worry, we're on schedule now. You'll be done on time right before 5 o'clock, but I'm going to put you into a breakout room, and I'd like you to consider these two questions. The people you serve, do you think they suffer from any inequities? And do you think inequity exists inside your system, whatever system that might be? So let me, oh, that looks good. Let me set those rooms up and open them. Dani, you want to put those questions in the chat, please?
Sure. Hello there, ladies.
Hello.
Hello.
I just want to teach next week's stuff right now because I want to get into.
I know. Hello, Blaze.
Hey, Blaze.
Hi.
How you doing?
How many people are on the call right now?
125 or so,
And
although
they can hear me?
they can't all see you because they're in breakout rooms. There's 15 people that are here, but my guess is these people are probably like
Away from there.
right, doing something different than us.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, there's a whole lot of people in here talking with us. Hi, I love you. Mwah. We're almost done. Good. That's what she said. Good, because I need you. You're my mommy. Gah.
Gah?
Yes. I'm
What's
just,
that for?
well, that's just all of the built up frustration I have and how
It is
all
painful to go over it again and again for these
again and
trainings.
again. And I mean, I want to keep going over it again and again, but like as I'm going through this, I just keep thinking of new examples of, oh, I just read this thing yesterday that shows this. And
you know, that might be a good question to add to this slide is, are you aware of any current examples in the media or within your system?
Right. Yeah, that one. Did you see that one about the couple, Kynetta, with the
yes.
white pictures and black pictures? That,
yeah, because the husband was white and the wife was black.
Oh, is that what it was?
That was what it was, because she had him go and do the walkthrough,
okay,
all the photos, and then he did the walkthrough.
Right, that makes sense, because I couldn't quite figure out in my head as I was explaining it. I was like, I know that they like took out all evidence of them being black, but I'm not sure then how they managed to.
Yeah, they were interracial couple.
They were interracial couple. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or the one that I did when I did the racial last week with the educators, I talked about how there was a pamphlet that was sent out. It was in some school district. A pamphlet was sent out to, like, let's say like the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade about like behavior problems and like appropriate and non-appropriate behaviors. In the pamphlet, all the disruptive behaviors were done by Black students. And so the thing that I was talking to them about is how racism shows up in education when you don't have like varied staff, and how they had like all white staff. And within that thing going out, the parents of color noticed within minutes and were like calling back to the school and all that kind of stuff, and was just talking to them about like, that's one of the reasons why you want to have like varied people like around you, because their ability to see and their perception of stuff, like things that you wouldn't even notice. Like in a second, I know I would have noticed.
Yep. It's enraging.
All right, I'm going to let them be in this room until just about 10 till.
Okay.
Because all we have left.
Yeah, just a few.
Kynetta, you're going to wrap up the groundwater metaphor observations real quickly and just move right into the media slides, where we have associations that are exaggerated in the media, and there are separate click-throughs. So I'll just you'll talk, but I'll run through them. And then the Hurricane Katrina pictures. And then I know I wanted to look at, I couldn't remember. Oh, this is just an article. Remember the article, When the Rules Are Fair but the Game Isn't?
Yep, I remember the article.
Okay. And so you'll talk about that. Yep. And that's the end of today. I'll summarize our agenda for, remind them that they have a day 2, and we'll do some other things, and then we wrap it up. So that's all we have, is really 3 or 4 more content slides. And that's it. Oh gosh, sometimes I do this to myself. I have trouble getting back to, there it is, back to where I can share my screen.
Yeah, I hear you.
I have too many clicks away. And this will remind me to preset
your videos.
The videos.
Yeah.
Did you hear the video okay though?
Yeah,
oh, yeah, it was
heard it fine.
Nice.
It was fine, and you handled it well, but I remember thinking, oh, we didn't like practice that one.
Luckily, it was just that one. We do not have any more videos this time.
I really need to figure out how to do presenter mode so I can see my notes. So, because I would so far prefer to just be clicking through
reading.
Yes, I mean, I am jumping back and forth between the PowerPoint.
Yeah, I have 2 slides. I have 2 screens. I have like 2 things up too.
Right. I'm almost at the point where I'm going to pull up another laptop and have it on there, because I just it's hard for me, and I have a big old screen. Maybe I'll just do it.
That's what I did the last time, is that I had it like on my laptop, and then I also had up my my note like my,
Mm-hmm.
my
And
tablet.
maybe I'll just like print out my sections because it's all the detailed data. I can't memorize it enough to be able to just like I usually do.
Yeah.
It frustrates me.
Yeah, because
We can
mine's
print out
was.
the notes pages for you, Dani.
Yeah, that's what I think I'm going to do. You know, one time I did it and it wasn't so bad, but this time I kind of got lost in the going back and forth trying to figure out where I was, and you know, and I practiced it beforehand too. So yeah, I think I think I'll do better if I just print out the dang presentation and have it in front of me, or at least my slides.
Oh my gosh, Kynetta, it took me forever to unpack that PowerPoint. And
it took her forever.
I'm sure.
So much better though. She did
like it's so
good.
nice looking and it's so much easier to speak it.
Good. Well, a lot of the data ones I could blow up to bigger on the screen once I got rid of all of their
extra stuff on the sides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just looks so much nicer.
All right, 3 more minutes. Hi to anyone who's watching the recording. I hope you've enjoyed it so far.
Yeah.
But you have to sit with us during the breaks and the breakouts.
My mom may be sitting in the next one. She was supposed to, she couldn't do this one because she had a doctor's appointment, but she may be able to come to the next one.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Jesse just asked me, are we still in break rooms?
Yeah.
And I said, yes. Are you? So I don't know where he is, but.
He looks like he's in one.
Okay, good.
I don't have anybody not. I have some people not joined, but I don't have anybody.
Floating.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And everybody's in a room with either 2 or 3 people, so that's good.
Good.
Somebody named Julie Tracy is with us, and she was one of the original researchers for that adventure therapy project back in 2013.
Oh, really?
She was Anita's grad student then, so she was helping with all the data. I see a fair number of names that I know and a ton that I don't. Lise is here.
Yeah, I saw Lee's out there. Jesse's somewhere, and I saw Denise Mitten, and I saw, who else did I see that I knew? Sky Gray, obviously.
Kathy Walker.
Yes, I saw Kathy's out there. I wonder how she's doing with the sharing.
All right, and Ray Palant, I know him, but I can't think why.
Yeah, I can't see the full list right now because they're all in the breakout sessions, you know.
All right, I'm going to give them 1 more minute. So I'm going to close the room. They can start coming back now, or they have 1 minute to finish up. Look at all those faces. All right, Kynetta, why don't you wrap up this metaphor for us?
So let's review our groundwater metaphor. So we know that racial inequity looks the same across systems. We also know that socioeconomic differences do not explain racial inequality, and we know that inequalities are caused by systems. But if we know all of this, where does this bias originate?
I'm sorry, what?
Question?
I heard a question.
I don't know. Somebody might just have been accidentally
unmuted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pop it into the chat if somebody has a question for us.
Okay. And so now what we're going to talk about is how does media representations on what is the impact of the way that Black men and boys are represented in the media. And so the opportunity agenda looked at some social science literature to look at how these representations impact the lives of Black boys. And so these are some of the exaggerations and things that we saw in the media when we looked at Black males. So the first one is general antagonism towards Black males, exaggerated views of, expectations of, and tolerance for race-based socioeconomic disparities, exaggerated views related to criminality and violence, so more violence and more criminal behaviors, little sympathy or like identification with Black males, reduce attention to like structural and other big factor problems or big picture problems that could be going on in their lives, and public support for abusive, punitive approaches to problems. And so one of the things that we talked about earlier was that Stroop effect, where we learned about like how our associations impact our behavior. So these distortions and these lack of accurate and like sympathetic and empathetic like discussions of Black male, these will lead to thinking that their problems are things that cannot be fixed. And another thing that happens is we have a problem of missing stories. A lot of like what we see in terms of Black males' lives talk about like lots of disadvantage or negativity in terms of males. Or another thing that we see is that there's just not lots of like positive like pictures of Black males in the media. So what happens when you either have a very negative view or then your story is just not there at all? And so we're going to look at how does this portrayal, and we talked about this in terms of this is something that we can see that goes back to Katrina, but it's something that we've seen very recently in terms of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that have been going around the country. So back at Hurricane Katrina, in the top picture, we see a Black person and the AP writes, a young man walks through chest-deep flood waters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday. Below, two white people. Two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. Same behaviors, but the way that they're looked at decides how do we treat them, what do we see of them, what do we think of them. And so when we think of stuff like this, what do you think that impact has on like loan officers, teachers, healthcare workers? Now this next article will be something that'll also be in your packets. And it's a great article that talks about what happens when the rules of a game are fair, but the game isn't. And so the example that they give is, what if me and Bobbi are playing Monopoly? And Dani's playing with us too. But me and Bobbi, we get to go around and play for about 2 or 3 rounds. And then Dani gets to join the game. Dani has the same rules that me and Bobbi have, but me and Bobbi have been playing a couple of rounds. So we already have money. When Dani comes in that first round of Monopoly, she can't even play on the board. That first round, you just go around the board, you don't do anything. So what happens that me and Bobbi, we have the exact same rules that Dani does, but Dani can never catch up with us. And so that is a good example of the minority experience often in this country, where we're told that we're given the same exact rules, but we haven't been a part of the game. And so how can we ever catch up? How is this equal? And so we've seen this also in COVID, where we talked about the example of a child. This happened in Baltimore. I'm from DC, so I remembered this story where a parent was going into a restaurant with her son, and the manager said that they couldn't come in because of the boy's clothing, and said that it was the way that he was dressed. And mom nicely pointed out a white child that was dressed in the same manner as her child. And then it was like, well, it's his shorts. And it's like, but his shorts are like his shorts. And so how the games kept changing, the rules kept changing.
All right, folks, that's going to have to wrap it up for us for today. We managed to get through our entire agenda, but next week, next Tuesday, we're going to go deeper. We're going to do some different things. And when we start next week, we are going to be looking at structural inequality and racial inequity by doing a virtual learning simulation to explore the racial wealth gap. So what happens when all the systems are inequitable? What's the long-term impact? And we're going to look at that in part through the legal system in the United States. We're going to hang out here for the last 5 minutes if anybody wants to chat with us or has specific questions. Otherwise, you can expect within the hour to get a PDF of this PowerPoint, the references for the articles that we talked about, and a couple of other handouts. I think that's it for today. If you have any questions, we're here for you. Otherwise, thanks for being with us. Try to go out there and make a difference in your circle, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, you all. Bobbi, you did great. All of you.